Welcome to the Fair Political Practices Commission's webinar for State Agency Conflict of Interest Codes. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ivy Brandman, and I will be one of your hosts for the webinar.
I'm Cynthia Fisher, and I will be your other host for today's webinar. Throughout this webinar, we will refer to the Fair Political Practices Commission as the FPPC. If you have questions during the live webinar, please type them into the questions box on the right side of your screen. We will answer questions throughout the webinar. If you find that you have questions following the presentation, you may email them to advice@fppc.ca.gov or call 866-275-3772.
The visual aids used in FPPC presentations are guides which contain only highlights of selected provisions of the law. They do not carry the weight of the law.
This is a screenshot to show you where to type your questions throughout the webinar.
During the webinar, we will cover the three components of conflict of interest codes, reviewing and identifying necessary changes to your agency's code, and the approval process. Regulation 18750 was amended last year to streamline the code approval process so we can efficiently process the code amendments as they are received. Again, if you have questions during the live webinar, please type them into the questions box on the right side of your screen at any time throughout the webinar.
All government agencies must adopt a conflict of interest code, whether it is a city, county, or state agency. The Conflict of Interest Code is the legal instrument requiring those individuals holding designated positions to disclose their financial interests on Form 700. Positions required to be designated are those that make or participate in making governmental decisions. The code also specifies what financial interests filers have to report based on their level of decision-making.
All state agencies should have received the biennial notice, which must be completed each odd-numbered year, and returned by March 1st. All of the biennial notice information is available on our website. Please note that state agencies are not required to have a draft of the Conflict of Interest Code by March 1st. They are only required to submit the completed biennial notice by March 1st.
Here is a sample of a completed biennial notice. The biennial notice is available on our website.
Most state agencies make changes to their code at least every 2 years. As a preliminary step, we recommend that you compare your conflict of interest code to your agency's existing organizational structure and ask yourself the following questions. Have new positions or divisions been created? Have they been abolished or have duties merged? Have duties of positions designated in the code changed to warrant adjusting their disclosure obligations? If you answered yes to any of these questions, it's time to amend your conflict of interest code.
Next, we will discuss the three components of a conflict of interest code. Conflict of interest codes can be broken down into three main components. The first component contains the terms of the code, which incorporates Regulation 18730, which includes all of the legal code requirements, such as when statements are due and where statements are filed. We refer to this as the incorporation page. The second component is the list of designated positions that are required to file Form 700. The third component contains the disclosure categories, which specify what types of interest filers need to report on their Form 700. This is an example of a conflict of interest code's incorporation page. The first paragraph incorporates Regulation 18730, and the second paragraph indicates where the Form 700s will be filed and retained. The second provision is the list of designated positions. This list must include every position in your agency that is involved in making or participating in making governmental decisions and therefore are required to file a Form 700. What does it mean to make a decision? Making a decision means voting on a matter, approving the budget, adopting policy, making purchasing decisions, and entering into contracts. Typically, positions that make a decision are at the top of the agency organizational chart, such as CEA positions, directors, and deputy directors. Positions that participate in decisions should also be designated in the Conflict of Interest Code. If a position participates in decisions, but someone substantially reviews the position's work, the position does not need to be designated. For example, a staff services analyst may participate in making decisions as listed on this slide, but she may also have a manager that substantially reviews her work. In this instance, the staff services analyst would not need to be included in the code. A position participates in making a governmental decision and needs to be designated in the code, even if the work is reviewed by superiors, if any of the following apply. The superiors rely on the data and analysis without checking it independently. The superiors rely on the position's professional judgment. The position in some other way actually influences the final decision. You may find it helpful to review the position's duty statement or job description to determine if the position participates in decisions.
When reviewing your list of designated positions, keep your top-level decision makers in the code. Eliminate positions that are strictly clerical, secretarial, ministerial, or manual in nature, such as office technicians, office assistants, and custodians. Then, review the positions in between those two levels to determine if they need to be included in the list of designated positions. Some agencies find it helpful to work with division chiefs and employees in other divisions to determine what positions should and should not be designated. Here is a visual of what was discussed on the last slide. Keep the positions on the top, remove the positions on the bottom, and review the positions in the middle. A staff services manager in one division might need to be included, but not a staff services manager in a different division. This is why it is important to look at all positions in all divisions to determine if the position should be designated. You may not designate all positions out of an abundance of caution. Only those positions that make or participating in making decisions may be designated. Looking at your agency's organizational charts is helpful in determining what positions should be designated. In the example on the screen, designated positions are outlined in blue. The positions near the bottom of the organizational chart may be either manual or clerical in nature, or have their work substantially reviewed. Note the number of levels of substantive review above the lower positions, like the AGPA, SSA, and office tech positions, which are not designated. Conflict of interest codes are not one-size-fits-all, and positions designated in one agency's conflict of interest code may not need to be designated in another's. Also keep in mind that at smaller agencies, a larger percentage of employees are typically designated because they tend to wear more hats. Remember that each agency is different and that the conflict of interest code should be tailored to fit the specific needs of your agency. Here are two separate methods for listing the same 8 positions. On the left, we have separately listed each level. On the right, we have consolidated the list. It is preferable to use the consolidated listing because you may be able to avoid future amendments. For example, this agency currently has Staff Counsel levels 1, 2, and 3. If the agency creates a new Staff Counsel 4 position, and they are utilizing the separate listing on the left, they will have to amend their code to include the new position. If the agency creates a new Staff Counsel 4 position, and they are utilizing the consolidated listing on the right, their code already includes level 4 and no amendment is required. Please keep in mind that if different levels of a position need different disclosure, or if one level of a position does not need to be designated at all, the consolidated listing won't work. For example, if a Staff Services Manager 1 does not need to be designated in the code, but a Staff Services Manager 2 does, the consolidated listing should not be used. In this position list sample, please note that positions are listed separately by division. This is especially important for large agencies to make it clear to filers and members of the public exactly who in the agency is designated in the code. This is also important because the staff services manager in administration may need a different disclosure category than the staff services manager in the enforcement unit. Typically, the head of the division is listed first. That position should have the broadest disclosure category in the division. All other positions should have the same or narrower disclosure. If your agency has committees with public members, you should review the duties and responsibilities of the committees. A review of committee meeting minutes will help determine if the committee is solely advisory and whether or not the committee members need to be designated in the Conflict of Interest Code. Newly created positions that are not yet designated in your agency's Conflict of Interest Code must still file a Form 700 if they are making or participating in making governmental decisions. These positions must file within 30 days of starting and must file under the broadest disclosure category in your agency's code until the positions are added to the code. Your agency may provide narrower disclosure using the Form 804. For example, if your agency creates a new data processing manager position, you can use the Form 804 to limit the position's disclosure to just IT-related sources. Please note that the agency, not the individual filling the position, completes the Form 804. A copy of the Form 804 is provided to the individual when she completes the Form 700, so she knows what her disclosure requirements are. The original should be maintained with the Conflict of Interest Code documentation to be used during the next amendment. This rule does not apply if a position was vacant and is later filled. This applies only to newly created positions. You must also include consultants in your list of designated positions. Consultants make decisions on behalf of your agency, serve in a staff capacity, and in that capacity perform duties that would otherwise be performed by a designated position. Keep in mind that not every outside contractor will meet the consultant definition, and your agency needs to have a mechanism in place to make these determinations. Form 700s are filed by the individual who meets the consultant definition, not by the firm they own or are employed by. Consultants often call the FPPC and question the requirement to file a Form 700. The FPPC will refer the consultant back to the agency and will only make a determination if the consultant first asks the agency and the agency and consultant jointly request a written opinion from the FPPC. Consultants default to the broadest disclosure category in the code. If your agency wishes to limit a consultant's disclosure requirements, this must be done in writing and may be done using the Form 805. This is a standard consultant and new position language that must be included in every Conflict of Interest code and provides the option to limit the disclosure for consultants and new positions as we discussed on the last two slides. If you are listening to this live and you have questions, please type them into the questions box on the right side of your screen. Cynthia, have we had any questions come in?
Yes, our first question is, are SSAs and AGPAs designated in most codes? The answer is no. SSAs and AGPAs aren't usually designated because their work is substantially reviewed by their supervisors. Keep in mind that sometimes in smaller agencies, an SSA or AGPA may need to be designated because they act more independently and wear more hats than SSAs and AGPAs in larger agencies. All right, Sarah has a question about the Forms 804 and 805. Sarah asks, are the Forms 804 and 805 required? What do I do with the Form 804 and 805? Do I send the FPPC a copy? Great question, Sarah. We get these questions a lot, so I'm glad you asked. The 804 and 805 are not required. If you do not use the 804 and 805, the consultants in new positions have to file under the broadest disclosure category in your agency's code unless you put something in writing narrowing the disclosure. We created the 804 and 805 to make this process as easy as possible, so we highly recommend that you use the 804 and 805 rather than draft your own documents. Copies are not required to be sent to the FPPC. They should be maintained with the Conflict of Interest Code. Now Scott asks, can we amend our code when it is not a biennial notice year? You can amend your code at any time and do not have to wait for the biennial notice period to amend your code. Your code should accurately reflect the organizational structure of your agency and be amended as often as needed. We have time for one last question. Okay, Maria asks if everyone in the Procurement and Contracts Division needs to be designated in the code. Not every position needs to be designated. One thing to take a look at are the positions following a pre-approved set of guidelines or rules. If they are, that's not considered to be making or participating in a decision, and they don't need to be designated. The positions who create and approve those guidelines need to be listed in the code. Next, we will discuss disclosure categories. Disclosure categories describe the types of economic interests that designated positions must report when completing the Form 700. Disclosure requirements must be tailored to the duties performed by the designated position it is assigned to. People commonly err on the side of caution and require positions to report too much. You may not assign designated positions overly broad disclosure categories. The 2 court cases listed on the screen ruled that doing so is illegal. It is important to ensure that designated positions are assigned to disclosure categories that are narrowly tailored to the duties the position is performing. We will next discuss some common errors in assigning disclosure categories, as well as provide some sample disclosure categories. Agencies often assign real property disclosure to designated positions out of an abundance of caution. If a position does not make or participate in making decisions regarding real property, the position should not be required to report real property interests. If you do need to include real property, you may limit it to a specific region. For example, if you have a position that handles only offices or branches in Northern California, then employees can disclose property located only within their assigned region. You can limit real property further by requiring disclosure of only those types of real property interests that are of the type to be sold or leased by the agency. When determining what type of real property disclosure you need, if any, it's important to find out who handles your agency's building leases. On your screen is a common category for those positions that make purchasing decisions. Most codes have 2 categories, one for officials that have agency-wide purchasing authority, and the second category reads the same, except in the place of the word agency is division or department, or whatever term your agency uses. For example, the designated positions in the procurement division would have agency-wide disclosure and a division's administrative services manager, because the position only purchases products for the division, would be assigned to the division-wide category. Larger agencies probably need the 2 different categories. This category can be used for agencies that regulate, permit, or license. This is a standard disclosure category for agencies who have an IT division. Many IT positions are highly paid, but they do not make purchasing decisions or participate in such decisions. Those positions are not required to be included in the code. If you're not sure what IT positions to designate in the code, you should review the job descriptions for those positions or discuss the duties of those positions with the supervisor to determine what positions to include. When drafting your agency's disclosure categories, ask yourself these questions. If you answer yes to any of these questions, you should add a category for grants, licensing entities, enforcement, and/or auditing to the Conflict of Interest Code. Sample disclosure categories are available on our website. If none of the categories on our website fit the needs of your agency, we can work with you to draft a disclosure category tailored to the specific needs of your agency. The gift limit and Honoraria Ban are another good reason to limit disclosure to those types of financial interests designated employees may affect in the course of their work. Time for a quick quiz. A person's duties include approving licensing programs for healthcare providers. Which of the following disclosure categories best suits this type of position? The correct answer is the second category. This is a good example of what we mean by narrowly tailoring the disclosure requirements for a specific position. We don't want to have the position report too much or too little. Ultimately, we want a disclosure category that requires only those interests that are specific to the position's duties and responsibilities. This position would not be subject to the gift limit and Honoraria Ban from all sources, but only the sources subject to her agency's regulatory permit or licensing authority. The Commission, after reviewing case law, directed FPPC staff to ensure that agencies always tailor the disclosure categories so that only sources that have the potential to be affected by an action of the employee are reportable. All right, time to take some more questions. If you have questions, please type them into the question box on the right side of your screen. Ivy, have we had more questions come in?
Yes, it looks like the first question is, how do I know who in my agency makes decisions about real property? Real property decisions are generally made only by very top-level employees, if at all. DGS often negotiates for office space on behalf of agencies, so it may be that no one in your agency makes real property decisions. You should ask higher-level officials at your agency to find out. Lisa asks, how many disclosure categories a code can have? This is a great question. A code can have as many disclosure categories as necessary to capture designated positions' financial interests, as well as narrowly tailor those interests to the duties performed by the positions. Some agencies have more than 10 categories, and other agencies only have 1 or 2. The next question, can we use existing disclosure categories in our conflict of interest code on the 804 and 805 you discussed earlier? Yes, you can use existing disclosure categories to narrowly tailor disclosure on the Forms 804 and 805. All right, we'll move on to the next section. Next, we will discuss the approval process. There are 2 types of code amendments, substantive and non-substantive. We will talk about substantive amendments first. Substantive amendments are more involved and require a 45-day notice period with the Office of Administrative Law, or OAL. Anytime a new position or revised disclosure category is proposed, it is a substantive amendment. When you start the process, be sure to use the agency's last approved code. Other documents, including job descriptions, may be requested by the FPPC consultant reviewing your agency's code. This is an example of Strikeout format. In this example, the agency provided brief explanations within the code itself. Explanations also may be included in a separate document. Samples of various explanations of changes are available on our website. Once the FPPC has reviewed the draft code and requested any additional information necessary, the code must be noticed with OAL. Employees must also be notified and given 45 days to comment on the code. A CEO declaration must also be signed by the head of your agency. Here is a sample of how to complete the Form 400 when you conduct your agency's 45-day notice period with OAL. Please keep in mind that amending a conflict of interest code is not the same process used to amend and adopt regulations with OAL. To notice your conflict of interest code with OAL, you simply need to complete the Form 400 and turn it into OAL along with a copy of your agency's notice. A template for the notice may be requested through the FPPC consultant assigned to process your agency's conflict of interest code. Here is a sample of a notice to staff regarding the code amendment. This is a great way to ensure that everyone receives a copy of the amendment. Be sure to provide the FPPC a copy of the email you send out. Your agency will receive the Form 400 back from OAL once it has been stamped by the Secretary of State's office. Forward a copy of this to the FPPC. The code is not finalized until it has been endorsed by the Secretary of State, and it is not in effect until 30 days after Secretary of State's endorsement. The process to amend a code with certain minimal changes is shorter. Non-substantive changes include renaming positions, deleting abolished positions, correcting typographical errors, or adding clarifying language. In order to process a non-substantive amendment, submit the items listed on the screen. We provided the most common questions about when the next Form 700 for positions are due. Please remember to always provide a copy of the Conflict of Interest Code to your filers. If you are listening to this live and have questions, please type them into the questions box on the right side of your screen. Cynthia, what new questions have come in?
Diego asks, why does the code have to be in strikeout underline format? Good question, Diego. When you submit the code to OAL, OAL must replace the old code in the California Code of Regulations with the new one. The strikeout underline version tells exactly what is being deleted and what is being added. All right, it looks like the next question is, what duty statements do I send to the FPPC? Do I just send the statements for the ones I'm not sure should be designated? Yes, if you are not sure about what positions should be designated, go ahead and send job descriptions in for the positions you're not sure about. Your FPPC consultant can help you determine whether or not to include them. Your FPPC consultant may also request additional job descriptions if she has questions about the position's disclosure category assignments. Okay, the last question is, does the board need to approve the Conflict of Interest Code? No, you are not required to take it to the board for approval, but you may if your agency's internal policy requires it. Members of new boards and commissions must file Form 700 within 30 days of assuming office, as opposed to waiting until their positions are added to the Conflict of Interest Code. This is to ensure disclosure is timely, as the process for amending a code can be lengthy. If there are major reorganizations or your agency is abolished, please let the FPPC know as soon as possible. No two reorganizations are the same, and it is important to work with FPPC to find a workable solution to the Conflict of Interest Code. Many helpful resources are available on our website, including sample disclosure categories and a checklist for agencies amending the code. Your input is important to us, so please remember to complete the survey that you will receive after this webinar. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.